You know that moment when you realize your neighbor isn't just inconsiderate, they're actually stealing from you? Well, what happened to me over the course of 18 months will make you question everything you thought you knew about property lines, neighborly disputes, and just how far someone will go when they think they can get away with it. By the time this story ends, my neighbor went from thinking he owned half my yard to losing his house entirely, facing federal charges, and owing me more money than most people make in 5 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the way this unfolded, you're not going to believe it. My name's Sarah, and 3 years ago, I bought what I thought was my dream house. A beautiful 1950s colonial on Maple Street in what used to be a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house came with 3/4 of an acre, mature oak trees, and what the realtor called established landscaping. What she didn't mention was that my neighbor, Dave Henderson, had been treating the previous owner like a doormat for the better part of a decade. The elderly woman who lived there before me, Mrs. Patterson, had apparently been too frail and too kind to stand up to Dave's increasingly aggressive territorial expansion. But Dave was about to learn that I'm not Mrs. Patterson. Dave Henderson was one of those neighbors, you know the type, mid-40s, balding, drives a pickup truck with truck nuts hanging from the back, and has strong opinions about everyone else's lawn care. He worked construction, which meant he was home by 3:30 most days, giving him plenty of time to monitor the neighborhood like some self-appointed HOA president. Except we didn't have an HOA, which somehow made Dave even more determined to enforce his own made-up rules. His wife Linda was nice enough, but she developed this nervous habit of apologizing for Dave before he even opened his mouth. Their 2 teenage kids mostly stayed inside, which should have been my first red flag about what kind of father Dave really was. The first month after I moved in, everything seemed normal. Dave would wave when he saw me in the driveway, made small talk about the weather, even offered to help me move some boxes. I thought I'd lucked out with decent neighbors. Linda brought over a casserole and apologized 3 times for it not being homemade, even though it was clearly fresh from her kitchen. The kids seemed polite when I saw them getting off the school bus. For those first few weeks, I actually felt good about my decision to move to this neighborhood. Then October came, and I decided to do some fall cleanup in the backyard. That's when I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. See, when I'd toured the house, the realtor had pointed out the property line, marked by a row of mature lilac bushes that Mrs. Patterson had planted decades ago. But as I was raking leaves, I noticed that Dave's shed was positioned awfully close to those bushes. Not just close, it was actually about 3 feet past the lilac line, sitting squarely on what should have been my property. I didn't want to start a neighbor war over a few feet, so I decided to do some research first. I went to the county assessor's office and got copies of both property surveys. What I found made my stomach drop. According to the official documents, Dave's shed, his garden beds, and about 1/4 of what he was using as his backyard was actually mine. We're talking about nearly 2,000 square feet of my property that he'd been treating as his own. But here's where it gets really interesting. When I looked at the property transfer records, I discovered that Mrs. Patterson had actually tried to address this issue multiple times over the years. There were letters, complaints, even a survey she'd paid for in 2016. Dave had been told repeatedly that he was encroaching on her property, and his response had been to essentially ignore her and hope she'd give up, which, sadly, she eventually did. I spent the next week thinking about how to handle this. Part of me wanted to march over there and demand he move his stuff immediately, but I'm not confrontational by nature, and I kept hoping there was some reasonable explanation. Maybe the surveys were wrong. Maybe there was some old agreement between neighbors that I didn't know about. So I decided to approach Dave diplomatically. Big mistake. I knocked on his door on a Saturday morning, surveys in hand, planning to have a calm, neighborly conversation about the property line situation. Dave answered in his work clothes, looking annoyed that I'd interrupted whatever project he was working on. I explained that I'd gotten the surveys and noticed there seemed to be some confusion about where our properties actually ended. I showed him the documents, pointed out the discrepancies, and suggested maybe we could walk the property line together to figure things out. Dave's reaction was not what I expected. He barely glanced at the surveys before handing them back to me with a dismissive laugh. "Those old surveys are garbage," he said. "I've been living here for 12 years, and that's been my yard the whole time. Mrs. Patterson never had a problem with it." When I gently pointed out that the county records showed she actually had complained multiple times, Dave's whole demeanor changed. His voice got louder, his face got red, and he started jabbing his finger toward my chest. Listen here, lady. I don't know what kind of trouble you're trying to start, but that's been my property since before you even knew this neighborhood existed. Those bushes don't mean anything, and some piece of paper from downtown doesn't change reality. I tried to stay calm, explaining that I wasn't trying to start trouble, just wanted to understand the actual property boundaries. That's when Dave said something that should have been my warning that this wasn't going to end well. You know what your problem is? You city people move out here thinking you can just change everything to suit yourselves. Well, this isn't the city, and some things aren't going to change just because you wave around some papers. Then he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath, even though it wasn't even 10 in the morning, and said, I suggest you drop this before it becomes a real problem. I went home shaking, not just from anger, but from the realization that I was dealing with someone who wasn't going to be reasonable about this. Dave had essentially threatened me for asking about my own property line. But I'm stubborn, and I don't respond well to bullying. So instead of dropping it, I decided to document everything and figure out my legal options. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to what Dave was actually doing on the disputed property. What I discovered was even worse than I'd thought. He wasn't just passively using my land, he was actively developing it. He'd built raised garden beds, installed a sprinkler system, and even poured a concrete pad for what looked like a future workshop expansion. All of this on my property, without my permission and apparently without any permits from the city. I also started noticing his behavior toward me had changed completely. The friendly waves stopped. When I was outside, he'd come out and start up his leaf blower or chainsaw, making it impossible to enjoy my own yard. If I was working in my front garden, he'd suddenly decide it was time to work on his truck in the driveway, revving the engine and playing music loud enough to drown out my thoughts. It was like he was trying to make my life miserable until I gave up and moved away. But the final straw came in early November. I woke up on a Saturday morning to the sound of chainsaws. I looked out my bedroom window and saw Dave and another man cutting down one of the oak trees on the disputed property. Not trimming it, cutting it down completely. This was a tree that was easily 60 years old, massive and beautiful, and they were destroying it to make room for Dave's planned workshop expansion. I threw on clothes and ran outside, yelling for them to stop. Dave saw me coming and actually smirked. "It's on my property," he shouted over the chainsaw noise. "I can do whatever I want with it." The other man looked uncomfortable, like he was starting to realize he might be in the middle of something he didn't understand. I told them both that they were cutting down a tree on my property without permission and that what they were doing was illegal. Dave's response was to rev the chainsaw louder and go back to cutting. I ran inside and called the police. By the time they arrived, the tree was down and Dave was already cutting it up for firewood. The officers were polite but not particularly helpful. They said it was a civil matter and suggested I contact a lawyer. Dave played innocent, showing them where he claimed his property line was and insisting he had every right to remove a tree from his own yard. The officers took notes, but it was clear they weren't going to arrest anyone or make Dave put the tree back. That night, I sat in my kitchen looking at the pile of oak tree chunks in what should have been my backyard, and I realized that Dave had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd escalated this from a property dispute to property destruction, and he'd done it with witnesses. Now, it wasn't just about a few feet of lawn. It was about thousands of dollars in damages and what was clearly going to be an ongoing pattern of harassment. Time to fight back. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting his clients' rights. Attorney Michael Rodriguez had been practicing real estate law for 23 years, and when I showed him the surveys, the photos of Dave's encroachments, and the police report about the tree, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "This guy has made so many legal mistakes," he said, "that I almost feel sorry for him." Almost. Rodriguez explained that what Dave had been doing wasn't just trespassing. It was adverse possession, property destruction, and possibly criminal mischief. The oak tree alone was worth $15,000 according to a certified arborist's assessment. But more importantly, Dave's years of improvements on my property had actually strengthened my legal position. Every garden bed, every sprinkler head, Every square foot of concrete he'd poured was documented proof that he knew exactly where he was building and chose to do it on someone else's land anyway. While Rodriguez started preparing legal documents, I began my own investigation. See, Dave's threat about this being his neighborhood and his attitude toward city people made me suspicious that I wasn't his first victim. So I started talking to other neighbors, and what I found out made my blood boil. Turns out Dave had been pulling this kind of thing for years. The neighbor on his other side, an elderly man named Frank, had been fighting Dave over a fence dispute for 3 years. Dave had installed the fence 6 inches onto Frank's property and refused to move it, claiming it had always been there. The neighbor across the street, Maria, told me that Dave had been dumping his grass clippings and leaves in the storm drain in front of her house, causing flooding in her basement during heavy rains. And the family 2 houses down had actually moved away after Dave mounted a campaign of harassment when they complained about his dogs running loose and destroying their flower beds. But the most disturbing story came from the Johnsons, who lived directly behind Dave. They told me that Dave had been systematically poisoning trees along their shared property line, claiming they were dropping too many leaves in his yard. 3 mature maples had died over the past 2 years, and when the Johnsons had tree service come out, they found drill holes filled with herbicide. The tree service said it would cost $40,000 to replace the mature trees Dave had killed. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a boundary dispute. I was dealing with a serial property criminal who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. And because his victims were mostly elderly or conflict-averse, he'd gotten away with it. Until now. Rodriguez and I developed a strategy that was both legal and absolutely devastating. First, we'd get an emergency injunction to stop any further development on my property. Then we'd file a comprehensive lawsuit that included not just the boundary dispute, but property damage, trespassing, harassment, and a demand for treble damages under the state's property destruction statute. But we weren't going to stop there. See, during my research, I discovered something interesting about Dave's construction work. Remember how he'd built all those improvements on my property without permits? Well, it turns out he'd been doing unpermitted work all over the neighborhood, including major modifications to his own house. And when you're doing construction work without permits, you're not just breaking city codes. You might be violating federal tax laws if you're not reporting the income properly. So, while Rodriguez handled the civil case, I started making some phone calls. First to the city code enforcement office, reporting all the unpermitted work I'd documented, then to the county tax assessor, reporting the property improvements that weren't reflected in Dave's tax assessments. And finally to the IRS tip line, because something told me that a guy who thought he was above property laws might have some interesting ideas about tax laws too. The injunction hearing was scheduled for December 15th, and I spent the weeks leading up to it documenting everything. I took hundreds of photos, got statements from neighbors, and even hired a drone operator to get aerial footage of the property encroachments. Rodriguez was building a case so airtight that Dave would have no choice but to settle or face complete financial ruin. But Dave wasn't done making bad decisions. 3 days before the hearing, I woke up to find that someone had spray painted "Go Home" in red letters across my garage door. My security cameras caught Dave's pickup truck driving slowly past my house around 2 in the morning, but the angle wasn't good enough to definitively prove he was the one with the spray paint. Still, the timing was awfully suspicious. Then, the night before the hearing, things escalated in a way I never could have predicted. I was in my kitchen around 9 o'clock when I heard what sounded like someone walking around in my backyard. I looked out the window and saw a dark figure near the property line, doing something with what looked like a shovel. I called the police immediately and watched from my dark kitchen as they approached. What they found was Dave, drunk and belligerent, attempting to move the survey stakes that Rodriguez had had professionally installed to mark the property line. He was literally trying to dig up the legal markers and move them 6 feet onto his own property, apparently thinking this would somehow change the official survey results. The police arrested him for trespassing, tampering with survey markers, and public intoxication, but the best part was that his midnight surveying expedition was recorded on 3 different security cameras, including his own. The injunction hearing the next morning was supposed to be a routine legal proceeding. Instead, it turned into a disaster for Dave that was beautiful to watch. Rodriguez presented our evidence methodically. The surveys, the photos, the witness statements, the police reports, and the security footage of Dave literally trying to move the property markers. Dave's lawyer, who clearly hadn't been prepared for any of this, kept trying to object to evidence that was perfectly admissible. But the judge was most interested in the security footage from the night before. After watching Dave stumble around my yard with a shovel trying to dig up survey stakes, the judge asked Dave's lawyer if he had any explanation for his client's behavior. The lawyer mumbled something about a misunderstanding, which prompted the judge to ask Dave directly if he understood the difference between his property and other people's property. Dave's answer was perfect. Standing there in his wrinkled court clothes, still probably hung over from the night before, he said, "Your Honor, I've been living there for 12 years, and that's been my yard the whole time. I don't care what some paper says." The judge stared at him for a long moment, then granted our injunction and ordered Dave to remove all of his improvements from my property within 30 days. He also awarded us attorney's fees and warned Dave that any further interference with the property would result in contempt of court charges. We walked out of that courthouse, and I felt like I'd won the lottery, but Rodriguez had a strange expression on his face. "Sarah," he said, "I think your neighbor just confessed to 12 years of knowing trespassing on the record. This case just became a lot more expensive for him." The 30-day deadline came and went with Dave doing absolutely nothing to comply with the court order. He didn't remove his shed, didn't fill in his garden beds, didn't even acknowledge that the court had spoken. So Rodriguez filed for contempt of court and requested additional damages for Dave's willful noncompliance. But while we were waiting for the contempt hearing, the other investigations I'd triggered started bearing fruit. The City Code Enforcement Office discovered that Dave had done over $60,000 worth of unpermitted work on his own house, including electrical and plumbing modifications that violated multiple safety codes. He was ordered to either bring everything up to code with proper permits and inspections or tear it all out. The estimated cost of compliance was over $40,000. The county tax assessor found that Dave had been underreporting his property improvements for years, avoiding thousands of dollars in property taxes. They hit him with back taxes, penalties, and interest totaling $12,000, with a lien placed on his house until he paid up. But the IRS investigation was the real bombshell. Turns out Dave had been running a cash-only handyman business for years, doing construction work throughout the neighborhood without reporting most of his income. When federal agents showed up at his house with a search warrant, they found records of over $300,000 in unreported income over the past 5 years. Dave was looking at federal tax evasion charges, penalties that could triple his tax debt, and possible prison time. The contempt hearing in February was like watching a man's entire life collapse in real time. Dave showed up without his lawyer, who had apparently dropped him when Dave couldn't pay his legal bills anymore. He tried to represent himself, which went about as well as you'd expect. The judge held him in contempt, ordered him to pay additional fines, and gave him one final deadline to comply with the original order or face jail time. But Dave was far from done making bad decisions. Instead of complying with the court order, he decided to try intimidation one more time. He started following me when I left the house, parking across the street from my office and calling my phone at all hours without saying anything. When I reported this to the police, they told me it was harassment and suggested I get a restraining order. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for March 10th. Dave showed up drunk again, this time with Linda, who looked like she'd been crying for weeks. When the judge asked Dave if he'd been contacting me against my wishes, Dave's answer was classic. "I wasn't bothering her, I was just keeping an eye on what she was up to." The judge granted the restraining order immediately and warned Dave that any further contact would result in immediate arrest. That's when Linda finally spoke up. In a voice so quiet the judge had to ask her to repeat herself, she said, "Your Honor, I'm filing for divorce. I can't do this anymore." Dave's face went white, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he looked genuinely scared. By April, Dave's world was completely falling apart. The IRS had seized his bank accounts and placed liens on everything he owned. The city was threatening to condemn his house if he didn't bring the electrical work up to code. His wife had moved out and was living with her sister. His construction business was under investigation for tax fraud, and he still hadn't complied with the court order to remove his stuff from my property. That's when Rodriguez dropped the final hammer. We filed a motion asking the court to authorize us to remove Dave's improvements at his expense and to award us additional damages for every day he'd been in non-compliance. The judge granted our motion and ordered Dave to pay for professional removal of all his encroachments, plus daily fines that had accumulated to over $15,000. The crew we hired to remove Dave's shed, garden beds, and concrete pad showed up on a Tuesday morning in late April. Dave came out of his house screaming that we couldn't do this, that it was his property, that he was going to call the police. I was watching from my kitchen window as the crew foreman calmly showed Dave the court order authorizing the work. Dave actually tried to physically block the crew from accessing the shed, which resulted in another police call and another arrest for interference with a court order. Watching them tear down Dave's shed and rip out all his landscaping was one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had terrorized his neighbors for years and finally facing consequences for his actions. But the story doesn't end there. The removal crew found something interesting when they tore up Dave's concrete pad. Buried underneath were electrical lines that Dave had run from his house to power his shed. Electrical lines that crossed my property without easements and weren't connected to any permitted electrical work. The crew had to call the utility company to safely disconnect everything, and the utility company had to report the illegal connections to state regulators. By summer, Dave was facing criminal charges for the electrical violations, federal tax evasion charges that could put him in prison for 5 years, and civil judgments totaling over $120,000. His house was in foreclosure, his wife had filed for divorce and was seeking spousal support, and his construction business was bankrupt. I felt bad for Linda and the kids who were innocent victims of Dave's narcissism and stupidity, but I felt zero sympathy for Dave himself. He'd had multiple opportunities to resolve this reasonably, and at every step he'd chosen to escalate instead of compromise. The final chapter came in August when Dave's house finally went to sheriff's sale. Nobody wanted to buy a house with federal tax liens, code violations, and a history of neighborhood disputes, so it sold for less than half its assessed value. Dave and what remained of his family moved out of state, presumably to start over somewhere else. I bought the house at the sheriff's sale, not because I needed a second house, but because I wanted to make sure the next neighbors were people who understood property lines and respected other people's rights. I fixed all the code violations, brought everything up to legal standards, and sold it 6 months later to a lovely young family with twin toddlers who think property surveys are important legal documents rather than suggestions. The money I recovered from all the legal judgments, plus the profit from flipping Dave's house, totaled just over $200,000. I used some of it to install beautiful professional landscaping where Dave's encroachments used to be, including 3 new oak trees to replace the one he'd cut down. The rest went into a college fund for his kids because they shouldn't have to pay for their father's mistakes forever. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money. It was the letter I got from Frank, the elderly neighbor who'd been fighting Dave over the fence for years. After Dave moved away, Frank was finally able to get his property line restored and his fence moved to where it belonged. He wrote to thank me for having the courage to stand up to Dave when everyone else was too intimidated to fight back. The other neighbors have all thanked me too. Maria's basement doesn't flood anymore because Dave's not dumping debris in the storm drains. The Johnsons planted new trees along their property line and haven't had any mysterious plant deaths. And the family that moved away after Dave's harassment campaign, they came back to visit last month and were amazed at how peaceful the neighborhood had become. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not just letting Dave have those few feet of property and avoiding the whole conflict. The answer is absolutely not. Dave wasn't just stealing land, he was stealing people's peace of mind, their sense of security in their own homes, and their faith that reasonable people can resolve disputes reasonably. Some people are reasonable, some people respond to kindness and compromise and mutual respect, and some people only understand consequences. Dave was the second type, and he needed to learn that there are still places in this world where property rights matter, where legal documents mean something, and where bullies eventually meet people who won't be bullied. My new neighbors are wonderful. They borrow tools and return them promptly. They keep their dogs on leashes and their music at reasonable volumes. When we have disagreements about tree trimming or fence maintenance, we talk about it like adults and find solutions that work for everyone. It's amazing how much more enjoyable life is when you're surrounded by people who understand that being neighbors means being respectful of each other's rights and property. And Dave, last I heard, he was working for someone else's construction company in another state, living in a rental apartment and probably telling anyone who'll listen about how unfair his life has been. I hope he's learned something from this experience, but honestly, I doubt it. Some people never learn that actions have consequences. They just keep making the same mistakes over and over again until they run out of people willing to put up with their behavior. But that's not my problem anymore. I've got my property, my peace of mind, and my faith in the legal system restored. Sometimes the good guys really do win, especially when the bad guys are too stubborn to know when to quit.